Hello, welcome to another installment of Cooking with Colbath. My name is Julie Colbath. I'm the coordinator of Civic Engagement in the Office of Student Life. This is the 7th episode, which is crazy. If you haven't seen the other ones, they're on YouTube and they're on Facebook, so feel free to watch them at your leisure. Today we're going to be making a ramen stir fry, and we're also going to be making some rice pudding. So let me tell you what we'll be using. So y'all are probably pretty familiar with these packs of ramen. Super delicious, also super cheap, which is nice. And we do have some in the pantry right now. So we'll be using those as our base. We're just going to be using the noodles, so we're going to throw away the seasoning packets. We're going to be using a pound of ground beef. If you're not a beef person, you can easily substitute ground turkey, ground pork, or a pound of chicken. You can cut up chicken pieces, or you could easily substitute tofu, add more veggies, or potentially add shrimp or something like that. The recipe calls for half a head of broccoli. This head felt sort of small to me in comparison to my other broccoli head in the fridge. So I'm just going to use all of it. I'm also a pretty big broccoli fan. We'll be using an onion. And the recipe calls for peppers, but not always the biggest fan of peppers, so we're going to be using a carrot instead. And then for the sauce that we're going to put on it, it's pretty simple. It's like a base of soy sauce. Soy sauce normally has wheat in it, so if you are gluten-free, make sure to check out the store for a different alternative. I think normally tamari is what a lot of like gluten-free people use. We'll be using some sriracha, some apple cider vinegar, some garlic, and some brown sugar. So it'll be a pretty simple, pretty quick recipe. I think it probably takes about 20 minutes or less. I have never made this recipe before, so we are doing this together. And then for the rice pudding, the recipe that I posted, again, I have never made it before. But I think it's a good way to use up some things that you already have, right? Like sometimes I overestimate how much rice I actually need, so then I'm trying to use it up. So I have some like cooked rice already. And so rice pudding is really nice because it's easy. It's basically rice. Grab my milk. Some milk. Some sugar. Some vanilla. And just a tiny bit of salt. So it's a super easy way to make a dessert, and that you can serve hot or cold, especially in these hot times. I'm looking for, like a cold treat. And so I'm excited to make rice pudding because it's been a long time since I've made it. All right, so I'm gonna take you over to the stove and our cutting board. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I have a pot of water right here. I'm gonna get it boiling while we're doing everything else, so that when we're ready to add the noodles, we don't have to turn it on and then wait for the water to boil. So I just turn that on. We can set it and forget it. All right, great. So let me figure out the best angle for y'all. All right, so the first thing that we're gonna do is chop off our veggies. So I'm gonna grab my broccoli, my onion, and my carrot, and I'm going to wash them. So just a small note this week. I know last time I told my cutting board was slipping all over, and so I told y'all that a good way to have it so that doesn't happen, right? Like is to put a wet piece of paper towel underneath. So right, if you put that under there, it's not slipping and sliding around. Super nice. All right, so for the broccoli, we're gonna do it similar to last week, but we're gonna make the florets a little bit smaller. I want it to cook faster, and I also don't necessarily want it to have like huge chunks, so I'm gonna cut off the stalk, and I just have a compost bowl right there, so you don't have to watch me try to put it in my bag. And then you can see I'm just going to start breaking some of the florets, and then we'll cut them up into smaller pieces. If you do save your vegetable scraps to make like vegetable stock, I have heard that like different vegetables, sort of like broccoli, it's not always the best to put in your vegetable stock because it can get sort of bitter, which is not a flavor that you generally want. All right, so this is pretty hard to break this one down, so we're going to start. Whoop, we lost one. We'll throw it in the compost, it's fine. So I cut more stalk off, and then it's more easy to break, and this is about the size, it's probably hard for y'all to see, a piece that I want. But I'm also, you can easily just cut it to make it into smaller pieces. And again, they don't necessarily have to be like super consistent. It's harder to do with vegetables like this, whereas it's easier to do with like onions. But as long as they're relatively the same size, it just helps, again, with even cooking. So you can, like, if you have part of the stalk, just so you can see, you can easily just cut it into smaller pieces, right? This part is also tasty, and so you can add those in as well. So we're going to cut the broccoli and the onion first, and we're going to saute those. And then while those are sauteing, I'm going to grate the carrot instead of cutting it into pieces, and we'll add that a little bit later on in the sauteing process, and so it'll be thin and won't take as long to cook. So we're going to have some nice chunks of broccoli. I think this recipe is nice because it doesn't require a lot of ingredients. Seems pretty adaptable, right? If you don't really like vegetables, you don't necessarily have to add them in. And if you have different like meat preferences, or you're vegetarian, you can easily add different vegetables, or you can use canned veggies, frozen veggies. I'm all about recipes that you can kind of use what you have on hand. So for this recipe, I don't think there was anything that I necessarily had to buy at the store. I did have the, feels like a lot, so I'm not going to cut these last few because this feels like a lot to me. So I'm going to turn on our pan. So I just have a large skillet. You could easily use a nonstick or like a stainless steel pan, with sort of whichever your preference is. Just make sure you put some oil in to help saute and make sure things don't stick to the pan. So like I was saying, I had frozen beef, and you want to be careful with how you unfreeze your meats. So there are a few easy ways to do it. If you're able to plan ahead enough, you can take things out of the freezer and put them in the fridge to dethaw. Right, that does take some different effort to know that you're going to make something ahead of time, because it can take a couple days for it to thaw, depending on, you know, what size or what cut of meat it is. So I didn't have as much time, so another way to do it is to, I'm going to throw this in here while I'm talking, is to put it in cold water. It is a little bit faster, right? I think you're supposed to change the water every 30 minutes, and for that 1 pound roll, it took about an hour to defrost. The quickest way, probably unsurprisingly, is to use a microwave. I'm not exactly sure how long you cook it for, but it is like a fast way, right? In under 10 minutes, you can have defrosted meat. So now we're going to cut our onion. So like we've sort of talked about before, we're going to cut off the ends. So that we create a flat surface that we can cut. And then I'm cutting it in half. And then I did not peel it beforehand, so I'm going to take off this outer layer. And onions are pretty quick to chop, so I just wipe off my hands because they're full of broccoli. So I'm going to make some cuts one way, and then turn it 90 degrees, and make cuts the other way so we get a nice dice. You could also like do thin strips if you would rather. It's your preference. So I'm going to do the same thing to this other half. Whoops. Part of it came up with my knife. And our water is also starting to boil, which is nice, but we won't add the noodles quite yet, just so they don't get too mushy. So I'm going to just add my onion in there with my broccoli. Lots of delicious veggies. Push this over for a minute. I'm just going to stir the broccoli and onion together so that it's evenly distributed in the pan. So this should, if you cut them relatively small, it should only take about 5 minutes for it to saute. And then once we finish sauteing that, we'll brown the beef. And then it's only a few more steps from there. So while those are cooking, I have my carrot. I'm going to chop off the ends. And the nice thing about grating is, especially when you're using whole carrots, it can be hard to get an even cut because it can be such a variable shape. Whereas grating just takes away all the effort. So you can peel your carrots. I don't normally, but then you can just, use a grater to create some carrot strips. Make sure you're careful once you get towards the end, that your fingers aren't on the very end of the carrot and get on the grater. Sometimes when it gets too close, just don't finish it. Seems like it'll be enough carrot. If you wanted to add more, you could always grate another carrot. Again, this recipe calls for peppers, so if you use that, you can just chop them similar to an onion. So I'm going to wait a minute before I add it in here. just because, like I said, it's really thin, and so it's going to cook a lot faster than the onion and the broccoli. This has been cooking for about 2 minutes. You can already start to see the onion getting a little bit translucent, which is good. I'm going to grab a bowl because we're going to take the veggies out, and we'll transfer them to a bowl while our ground beef is cooking. Let me just grab a bowl. If y'all have any fun ways that you normally use ramen noodles or like upgrade your ramen, feel free to throw it in the chat. A lot of the times if I'm making the ramen like traditionally like it says on the packet, I'll add a soft-boiled egg. I'll try to add some mushrooms, onions, sometimes broccoli or carrots. Let me grab a fork so we can poke the broccoli to see how it's doing. It's still a little bit hard. Again, depending on how small you cut it will depend on how quickly it cooks. And like we've sort of talked about before, it also, cooking time can be variable based on what kind of pans you're using, what kind of heat source you're using. So it's nice to have a little bit of patience and flexibility when you're cooking. I know sometimes I get frustrated when things don't cook as fast as they say they're going to. I'm going to add the carrots in now. I'm just mixing it again so it's consistent throughout the pan. And we want to make sure we cook our veggies to like our desired tenderness now because they won't really get cooked that much again after we take them out of the pan. We're going to be browning the beef, and then once we brown the beef, basically we're throwing in the noodles, throwing in the sauce, and then we'll be done. So again, pretty easy, pretty simple recipe. Broccoli is starting to get a little bit softer, so it's almost to the point that I want it to be. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes. But while that's happening, we can do a little bit for the rice pudding. The rice pudding seems super easy, which I'm super stoked about. So what we're going to do is throw our cooked rice, our milk, our sugar, our vanilla, and a tiny bit of salt in the pan. So here we can come over here for a minute. Grab my pan. So I just have a small saucepan, so I'm going to half this recipe because I don't want a ton of leftovers. I'm not sure how well this would freeze. So I'm going to take my rice, put it in the pan. I'm going to take my milk. The nice thing about this recipe is it did, like say you could easily use almond milk or any sort of non-dairy milk. I'm going to take my sugar, put it in there. Let me see. me check how much vanilla we need. Okay. Grab a measuring spoon. Measuring spoons like this are nice because they are easily adjustable. Right, and so I need to add 3/4 of a teaspoon of vanilla, which is kind of a strange amount, so I'm able to just hold it while I'm pouring to get the right amount, because a lot of the times teaspoon measurements come in like quarter, half, and like 1. So that's great, and then we're going to add just a tiny bit of salt, so I have 1/8 of a teaspoon right here. And then we're just going to put that on the stove, so let me move you back. So everything is in our pot. Ooh, forgot about my broccoli that I dropped. I'm going to turn that on, and it says to bring it to a vigorous simmer on medium-high heat. This is starting to get crispy, so I'm going to take it off, and like I said, we're going to put it in a bowl because we're going to use this pan to brown our beef. A little bit of it gets left behind in the pan, it's no worries. It'll just cook with the beef. Alright. So you can see our pan is mostly cleared out, so we're going to grab the beef. And then I normally, if I have like a roll like this, we'll just sort of slice it open like that, and then just squeeze it out into the pan. I'll wash my hands. And I'm going to add a little bit more oil just so that it can brown. So my pan was a little bit too hot and it was splattering. So make sure you adjust the heat on your pan so it doesn't do that. Since the pan is already hot, it won't take too long for this beef to brown. I think the recipe says about 5 minutes. And you basically just want to make sure you're not seeing any pink. So make sure you chop it into smaller pieces. And you'll want to kind of like flip it over at some point so it doesn't, one side doesn't get all of the heat source. Otherwise, one side can get super done and the other side can still be pink. So, great. I'm going to turn the heat back up a tiny bit since I turned it down since it was splattering. And then I'm going to grab a smaller spoon. So I'm going to mix our rice pudding together. And the nice thing with this recipe too that you could try, and if you try, let me know, you can do it with uncooked rice, which I don't know, that might be better. I don't know if it will if the rice will pick up the milk flavor more so. But I liked that recipe because I could use up rice that was already in my fridge. So again, we're going to let that come to a vigorous simmer, and then we're going to reduce it and just let it simmer for about 10 minutes. But you can probably see if I move you that our beef is starting to brown more so. So the nice thing read about beef is that it can cook pretty quick. Whereas bigger cuts of meat take longer amounts of time to heat through properly. So this will hopefully only take a couple more minutes. And then since we're almost, let me look at my little directions that I wrote down. While that's cooking, we're going to make the sauce. So let me grab a bowl. Let me scoot you again to my table. So I'm going to move my cutting board because we don't need it anymore. Cool. So I'm going to grab my little, sometimes I write my recipes down. It's easier to me than looking at my phone or going on my computer. So I guess I didn't actually write it down. So we're going to scoot forward. I'm going to split screen so that I can see what I'm doing. Do y'all have a preferred way of, do you normally look at your phones? Do you normally print recipes off? I'm going to grab a whisk quick. Okay, so we're going to use a 1/4 cup of soy sauce. So instead of opening this and then letting it slowly come out of the little spout, I unscrew the cap off. So we're going to take a 1/4 cup and pour it in our bowl. We shouldn't need this again, so I'm throwing it in the sink. I'm just going to move around our beef a little bit because some spots look done and some spots still look a little bit red. So I want to make sure that if, the red spots were more so on the edges of the pan, that we're getting them into the middle, which it might be a little bit hotter. All right, so that's almost done. All right, so we have a 1/4 cup of soy sauce, a tablespoon of brown sugar. So brown sugar, as you might know, when you do it, you don't want it to be loose, you want to pack it. So you can use a spoon, you can use your hand. So here we have a packed tablespoon of brown sugar. And then we need a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. If you don't have apple cider vinegar, there are other types of vinegars that you can pretty easily swap out. I know especially in some different Asian dishes, right, there are rice vinegar, different sesame oils, right, and so it's pretty easy to look online to see what is easily swappable. Cool, and then we're going to do 2 teaspoons of sriracha. So I have 1 teaspoon right here. So we got 1. We got 2. You could always, if you want it spicier, you could always add more sriracha, or you could wait and add some later. Alright, and then this calls for a clove of garlic. I think it's nice to have this like minced garlic already ready. It cuts down on some time, and then my hands don't smell like garlic. So generally for like every clove I use a teaspoon of minced garlic. You can add more again if you'd like. So then we're just gonna whisk that together. And right, like there might be a few chunks of brown sugar. It might not dissolve as easily, but don't worry, once it gets warm, it'll dissolve. So that was pretty easy, pretty quick. Our beef is done. So I'm gonna put our noodles in. So I'm gonna open the packages. This calls for 2 packages, so it doesn't really matter what flavor you get since we're not using the flavor packets. So I'm going to discard this packet and just put this brick in our boiling water. I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. Packet noodles. We're going to set the timer for 2 minutes. Alright, so those are going to cook. Our rice pudding is starting to boil a little bit. So we're going to let that, we're going to turn it down to a low simmer. I'm just going to let it cook for 10 to 12 minutes. It'll get nice and creamy. The rice will sort of soak up some of the liquid. So once our 2-minute goes off, then I'm going to set it for 8 more minutes. Alright, so we're going to drain some of the liquid in the beef. That's just all fat that has come off, so we're going to drain some of that. And then we're going to add in our veggies. Starting to smell so good. Now I'm going to poke. So sometimes with noodles, you have to like poke the noodles down if they're not submerged under the water. So sometimes when they get softer, right, it helps to move them around a little bit. So we've got our beef. And again, right, like this recipe seems adaptable enough that if you wanted to add more veggies, and say you add more veggies and then like you feel like the flavor's not as strong, you could double the amount of sauce that you make and pour more over. So we're gonna put a little bit of salt on here. Alright, so it seems like our noodles are probably done. We're gonna put a little bit of pepper on here. And I'm gonna mix it around again. Alright, I'm gonna turn off my noodle. Throw this one. So you can see we've got a good mix of beef and veggies. So you could drain the noodles if you want. I'm just gonna use my like noodle spoon and just add them in. Almost forgot to set the timer for the rice pudding. So I'm just gonna throw those in. You want to make sure. Excuse me. You want to make sure that some of the water drains out of there, because you don't want to add a bunch of water into here. Careful, they are hot. So we'll add these in, and then we'll add our sauce in, and then we'll toss it to combine. And then it'll be ready. You can easily top this with scallions if you have them. Scallions aren't always something that I have on hand. I'm more often likely to have green onions. So if you wanted to, you could easily slice up some green onions or scallions, put them on top. Trying to get some of these random noodles. Alright. So that's that. Now we have our sauce, which doesn't translate well to the camera. But we're going to pour it over. And again, I really like sauce, and so depending on if I feel like there isn't enough, I might just make a second batch and throw it over there. Wipe my hands quick. And so I'm going to grab some tongs because I feel like that'll be easier to kind of toss all of this together. Do an initial. Sweep with the spoon, and then I think sometimes with noodles it's hard because it can be hard to incorporate everything. So I'm going to take, because you can kind of see that the noodles are congregated on one side and a lot of the filling, or like the other part of the stir fry, is congregated on the other side. So sometimes I think it's easier to use tongs because then you get a better grip and you can kind of easily move the noodles around. You could probably do it with the pasta spoon. Is there a name for that? I don't really know. It seems like a spoon colander to me. I'm sure there's a name that I just can't think of. So, cool. That's all we had to do. So that's pretty easy. So I'm gonna turn it off. Then you can just serve it up. And the nice thing about this too, I think you can easily like put it in the fridge and reheat it for leftovers. If you don't love leftovers or don't have a lot of people in your household, I know sometimes I get really excited about a recipe and then I make it and then I feel like I'm eating it for days, which can be frustrating. You can easily cut recipes in half. So this one would be easy to cut in half. It might be kind of a bummer, right? If you don't often just have half a pound of meat, but you could easily cook up like 1 pound of meat, put half of it aside for something else, like if you wanted to make tacos or whatever else. One thing that you do want to make sure you're doing with this, which I realize with the glare you can't really see, this rice pudding is stirring it every so often so that the rice doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan. But I think it'll be good. The nice thing with rice pudding is you can kind of add in what you want. Traditionally, people will add in raisins. So if you have raisins, you could throw them in there afterwards. You could top it with a little bit of cinnamon. I think some like sliced almonds or like other sort of nut might be good on there. So if you have any additions to rice pudding, please throw them in the chat. It's always good to get some new ideas, right? There's probably something that I'm not thinking of that would be great in the rice pudding. I'm gonna give this a try and see if it's any good. Hopefully it is. If not, we might just have to add more sauce. So, try to grab some noodles. It's got a nice flavor to it. I probably will fry an egg and put it on top. That's one of my favorite things to do with ramen and different like noodle dishes or fried rice. If you again like want this a little bit more saucy, because it's got a good flavor, but it's not super saucy, you could double the amount of sauce that you make and throw it in there, or just add some more soy sauce if you'd rather. Yeah, and then you might want to, depending on your preference, season it with some more salt and pepper. With this rice pudding, like I was saying before, you can use cooked rice or uncooked rice. I think if you are using uncooked rice, like be prepared that this is going to take longer because the rice will need more time to soak up the liquid. So I'm going to look at the recipe quick to see what it says. Okay. So it says reduce the heat to maintain a bare simmer and cook uncovered, stirring occasionally until the rice is very tender and the mixture starts to thicken. 20 to 22 minutes for uncooked rice, 10 to 12 minutes for cooked rice. And then you can remove it. Oh, I guess I shouldn't have added the vanilla. But you can remove it from heat and then you stir in the vanilla, and if you want some butter, that might be good, make it nice and creamy. And if you want it to have more sugar, you can add it then. So it says that the rice pudding will continue to thicken as it cools, and so if you need to thin it out, you can easily just add more milk. And then you can eat it warm or you can eat it cold, your preference. Okay. So that was about 10 minutes. I'm going to get a new fork that's not my stir fry fork or spoon and try it to see how the rice is. It's not like, hasn't really thickened yet. It could be the burner that I have it on isn't ideal. It's one of the like, what do they call it? Precise simmer burner. So I'm gonna grab a spoon and we'll try it and see what's happening with the rice, if it feels like it's getting tender. I know that rice pudding is one of like my favorite things to get at an Indian buffet. I know buffets aren't really happening so much anymore. It has a good flavor, but I'm gonna let it thicken some more time. But I think, right, like I can post a picture when it's done, but if you've had rice pudding, sometimes you know there's variability in like, I don't want to say soupy, but how liquidy it is. So if you want yours to be less liquidy, cook it a little bit longer so that the liquid kind of like evaporates, you know, and sort of simmers down. If you like it a little bit liquidy-er, because that seems to be a word, don't like cook it as long or add more milk if you'd like. I'm gonna set a timer for 2 more minutes, otherwise there is a chance that I will forget about it. But thank you so much for joining today. Please let me know if you tried the recipes, and if you have any questions, you can always throw them in the chat, or you can message us. I'm happy to respond. I would also love any recommendations on things to make. Right, sometimes I think it's hard to come up with new stuff, and so if you'd like to see something and not necessarily have to try it yourself, please let me know, and I'd be happy to do it. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Bye, y'all.